Okay, let's take a look at what we got here. We got a test coming up. Test is going to be Wednesday and Thursday. Black Day Wednesday, um, Gold Day Thursday. And it's just been a very disjointed unit. Last year it was that's a challenge. So I'll talk about the challenges of it in class, but I don't want to spend too much time yapping about anything other than the content because it's a big long review sheet. All right, so I'm going to start right here. And we're looking at economics here. And so the first thing you have is populist proposals. So let's go ahead right here and take a look at them. You've seen them twice. Populists, are the folks that want to look out for the farmers. We just looked at William Jennings Bryan. And they're going to kind of rise in one form or another after the Panic of 1873, and then again after the Panic of 1893. And they're going to come up with a series of proposals. So our acronym is DRIP, SIR. So the SIR is the economic stuff they wanted. They wanted a shorter workday for the factory workers. Remember, they're reaching out to them. Coin and free silver, 16-to-1 ratio. That would inflate the currency. That's good for indebted farmers. An income tax. Take from the rich, from the railroad men, Vanderbilt, and the industrialists, give to the poor. And then the government would take over the railroads to make shipping rates reasonable for the farmers. The political stuff, they don't want the party bosses choosing. They don't want the industrialists choosing the politicians and controlling the politicians. So they want the people to directly elect senators. That's going to become they're going to be unsuccessful at most of these, but over time, a lot of the things they want are going to get enacted. A referendum and an initiative. An initiative is when the voters initiate something, some action they're going to put on the ballot and then vote on it. A referendum is when the leaders refer an item on the ballot for the people to vote on. But both of them is more power to the people, less power to the party bosses and the industrialists. Immigration restrictions, there's the economic thing. So you got two ways in which they're reaching out to the factory owners with the shorter work days and the immigration restrictions and a one-term presidency. All right. So that's the populists. We will see them soon and very soon, but I'm going back over here to the railroads. All right, and let's see, is this the one we want? There you go. All right, so Transcontinental Railroad. Transcontinental Railroad, you're building from Nebraska to California, so it's the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific Railroads. Oh, what do I need to do? I need to make it bigger, don't I? I always forget that. All right, so hopefully you can see that a little bit better. And so if we go back to the PowerPoint, so Irish workers were working for the Union Pacific, going from Omaha. So it's going to be Chinese workers working for the Central Pacific. They're working for Stanford. They're going to meet over here, and you see that the Union Pacific lays a little more track because they're basically building over plains. And there's a place in Wyoming, let's say it's right here maybe, or right here, I don't know, not sure which, but where you can kind of get around through the Rockies. You don't have to go over the Rockies, but Sierra Nevada, you got to blast through with dynamite. So the Chinese going to have a little harder time of it, so not going to be able to move quite as fast. Wedding of the Rails is in Promontory Point, Utah. There it is there. And Stanford, Leland Stanford is the guy who drives the final spike through the railroads with a golden hammer. They have a big ceremony there. And that's a big deal because they're going to allow people to make it out to the west. It's really going to spell the beginning of the end for the Plains Indians. Innovations that, let's see if there's innovations that you needed for the railroad. I don't know that quite made it. Let's see. I don't think so. All right, so I'm going to leave that alone for the time being. All right, let's go on to the captains of industry. So you got four guys, right? Vanderbilt, Carnegie, Rockefeller, and Morgan. All right, and Vanderbilt's the railroad man. Rockefeller is in Standard Oil. Morgan is the banker, and Carnegie is U.S. Steel. All right, so we're back over to the stuff, and there we go. There they are. All right. What are we going to say about them? It's trust. They're using trust and monopolies. They've got all the money, so they're the ones that are making, kind of pulling the strings politically. So the perception is that these guys are running not only the economy but the government. Let's keep going. All right, there's a couple of cartoons showing their political power. Rockefeller on the left, Vanderbilt on the right. Vanderbilt was in railroads. You got a couple of attempts to rail them in politically, and neither one of them worked. The Interstate Commerce Act creates the ICC to regulate the railroads, get fair shipping rates and that sort of thing, but it was always railroad men who were members of the ICC. So the railroad men controlled the politicians. The politicians would put railroad men buddies on the Interstate Commerce Commission, and so the railroads really did get regulated. Sherman Antitrust Act said it was illegal to have a trust, but it got used against the unions. It was in the Pullman Strike, where it got used against the unions, where the strike got declared illegal, rather than used against the trusts themselves. Monopoly is where you got one company controlling an entire industry. You almost have that. Really what you get is trust, where companies are working together at the direction of one most powerful company, Standard Oil. And they're running the industry, even if they're not the only ones involved there. All right, let's see what we've got over here on the review sheet. Okay, I'm going to get rid of this review sheet so I keep. All right. Okay. So what do we got? Next, we got the inventions, just like it says. All right, so we'll go back. And so you've got the Bessemer process. The Bessemer process is that hellacious-looking thing where blowing cold air on hot iron, and it looks like the inside of hell, or lava in a blast furnace, and it makes steel cheap, and kind of makes human lives cheap too. You had something like 10,000 or 20,000 guys dying in steel mills a year, and they were working these awful long hours, low wages, 7 days a week, 12 hours a day. That's going to be the one that leads to the Homestead strike. All right, Bell is our inventor of the telephone. Also, we know that he invented the metal detector. All right. Edison invents everything. So the record player, that's a phonograph. The copier, that's a mimeograph. The tape recorder, that's a dictaphone. Movies, that's a moving picture. And, of course, the light bulb. Okay, so he's really important. All right. Let's go back to the review sheet. Okay, so there's our inventors. All right, let's go through maybe some of these. I think I'll go through these without the PowerPoint. So social Darwinism is survival of the fittest. That's the way that the industrialists justified having the monopolies and the trusts. That the businesses that couldn't compete, well, they weren't as fit. Herbert Spencer is the guy who comes up with that. He's applying Darwin's theory of natural selection to society. Darwin, ironically enough, disagreed with social Darwinism. His theory is about nature. All right, the Gospel of Wealth is similar. Carnegie has this one. And the Gospel of Wealth says that the government ought to practice laissez-faire. Let's get laissez-faire in there somewhere. We got to have that, right? We'll put it like there. All right, so that's the dominant, probably not spelled right. That's the dominant economic theory of the time, that the government just ought to leave these guys alone. And Carnegie defends it by saying, look, we're the best guys at making money. Once we've made our fortunes, we'll give the money away. We'll be philanthropists. And we have an obligation to give money away. So Carnegie gave, I believe he gave $35 million away before he died. Libraries was his favorite cause. And Rockefeller gave $50 million, kind of healthcare issues. Also colleges were kind of his favorite cause. All right, the working conditions in the factories were awfully rough. So that's the gospel of wealth. Working conditions of factories awfully rough. Long hours, low wages, child labor, women working in very strenuous physical jobs. The steel industry is the worst. 7 days a week, 12 hours a day, people dying on the job. All right, let's go over here and take a look at the challenges that strikes are going to have, that unions are going to have. If I go right there, all right, and I go down. All right, so there's that gospel of wealth. You can pause that and think about it for a second if you want to. All right, there's the working conditions. The life is real repetitive as well. Okay, so a lot of strikes for 20 years, 23,000 of them. The challenges that strikes faced were the replacement workers, scabs. A lot of times those scabs will be the new immigrants that we learn about in the next chapter. Also, all the political power the industrialists have. They can hire the best lawyers. The press is almost always on their side. The judges are pro-industrialists, the politicians, and they bring in the Pinkertons. Pinkertons most famously brought in the Homestead Strike. Homestead Strike was a lockout. The workers were locked out of the steel mill. You sign a yellow dog contract, meaning you promise not to join a union. And if you go on strike, you get put on a blacklisted, meaning not only you're fired, you can't get hired anyplace else. Here's our unions. The first two are pretty similar. They're not very successful because they let in everybody, skilled and unskilled. The Depression, the Panic of 1873 kind of does end the National Labor Union. Knights of Labor, also skilled and unskilled. Remember, unskilled workers are easier to replace by scabs, so it's harder for strikes to be successful. Terrence Powderly's the leader of it. Both of these, wanted kind of radical, almost socialist economic reforms. And the Knights of Labor had anarchist members, and anarchists threw a bomb in the Haymarket strike that undermined the Haymarket strike. Most famous of these, most successful, is the most practical one, the American Federation of Labor, led by this guy Gompers, one of the new immigrants, as opposed to one of the Irish immigrants. And they would negotiate kind of directly with the factory owners for kind of better conditions. They'd use a long strike and they'd charge union dues, and workers could draw from the funds that were stored up from the union dues if they're going on a long strike. So the AFL is the most successful. All right, now so then we have these 4 strikes, and I believe that's my next thing on the review sheet. Let's take a look. So there it is right there. And the last of the Gilded Age economic stuff. All right, so the railroad strike of 1877. So it's kind of a railroad sandwich with the meat being H's. The railroad strike, you got railroad workers hurt by the Panic of 1873. It starts in West Virginia, but then it spreads all over the country. And people would stand in the railroads and stop the trains until the railroads are getting shut down. So Hayes calls out the troops. He's the president. Remember, he got elected. The Compromise of 1877 made him president. Anytime it involved trains, the president gets involved, calls in the troops. All these things are going to be unsuccessful. Haymarket Square is going to be in Chicago. It's the McCormick Harvester Strike. They're making farm implements, farming tools, the reaper. Hadn't invented tractors yet. They're fighting for an 8-hour day, and there's a riot, and strikers get killed. So then they have a meeting to talk about the dead strikers, and at Haymarket Square, and at that protest, an anarchist threw dynamite and police got killed. And from that point forward, the Knights of Labor were seen as too radical. Okay, next we have the Homestead Strike. We watched a little bit of a film on this one. This was right outside of Pittsburgh. Frick is kind of the tough guy who's in charge of keeping keeping the Union from having too much power, and Carnegie doesn't want to get his hands dirty, so he leaves the country during the strike or during the lockout. There's a big fight. They bring in the Pinkertons. The strikers win. They beat up the Pinkertons, but then one anarchist, it's not multiple anarchists, it's one anarchist shoots Frick in the neck and stabs him, but Frick beats him up, and it makes the papers. And so, again, the strikers are seen as too radical. All right, and then finally I'm going to have the Pullman Strike. Okay, Eugene Debs is your leader. Leader of the National Railway Union. Panic of 1893 takes place. There you got this company town right outside of Chicago. The wages go down while the rent stays high. And the railroads start attaching mail cars to the Pullman cars. And so then Cleveland can say, Cleveland's a big laissez-faire guy, this Democrat. The Democrats are going to change after Cleveland. Unpopular president who's laissez-faire during this bad economy. Kind of a little bit of a Herbert Hoover kind of figure. But they use the rail cars to justify calling out the troops, and then, the strikers lose again. This is the first time you see Eugene Debs. Our Labor Day celebrations kind of come out of this. They shut down the strike. They throw Debs in jail. The strikers don't get improved conditions, but Labor Day becomes a holiday, national holiday. Cleveland makes it a national holiday to recognize the contributions of labor. All right, so hey, maybe pause for a second. Okay, I'll go back up here to the review sheet. All right, so that gets you through the strikes. Okay, then you got urbanization. All right, let's see. I'm concerned about time given the number of chapters we got going here. So urbanization is the move to the cities, and what, you got 3 cities with over 1 million people: Chicago, New York, and Philadelphia. And as the population in the latter part of the 19th century is doubling, the city population is tripling. That Turner thesis ends up being incorrect because a lot more people move to the cities than move to the West when you're talking about that Turner thesis. Okay, so let's see what we have. So things moving, so it's always jobs moving people to the cities. So there you have it. And then conveniences, electricity, plumbing, telephones, the bright lights, the big cities, department stores. There's a book Sister Carrie about an old young lady comes for, the modern conveniences. Things don't work out far. And you can fit everybody there because you can build up and out. You got the skyscrapers, and then you've got the trolley cars that allows middle class folks to move out to the suburbs. All right, but people are packed in there close together. So you've got these tenement houses. These are the apartments where really the immigrants are going to live, and you're packing everybody in close to these apartments, and then people are going to get sick. People are going to get frustrated. They're going to commit crime. So crime becomes a city issue, and the police are invented. People start throwing things away right and left. Baltimore smelled like 1 million skunks. Let's go ahead and let's just translate that. Nobody uses the word polecats anymore. So I'll just say skunks. You got horse manure everywhere. Horses are prolific poopers, and they only lived a couple of years in the cities, and then they'd fall down dead. You'd have kids playing around horses and horse manures. There's no fish even today. There's not enough fish even today in the Chicago River for all the pollution to where fishing is not allowed. The fish are like radioactive or something. So a lot of pollution there. Okay, what am I going to have? All right, so there's the city problems. Leisure activity is going to be the sports, right? So you got baseball, football, basketball. Baseball to remind you of life back on the farm, slower paced sport, also united the different immigrant groups. Football prepares you for war. Teddy Roosevelt's a big fan. And basketball is what I need right now. Wintertime exercise, so that you don't get all unhealthy during the wintertime. So it's an indoor activity. You also have boxing. We looked at where folks gather at the saloon and they kind of they let out their frustrations watching the guys pulverize each other. And the circus, Barnum and Bailey Circus, is invented. All right, the new immigrants is going to be the J-groups, Jews, Greeks, Russians, Italians, Polish, Slavs. They're getting pushed off of their farms in southern and eastern Europe by bad economy. So then they go to the cities of those countries and can't find jobs. And then you've got the lure of jobs, and the industrialists don't want unions, so they would send advertisements saying the streets are paved with gold and America's just this perfect place. You won't have any problems over here. So that would pull them over here. All right, the party bosses, in addition to getting them jobs and turkeys and presents, also control the local government that builds the schools and the hospitals and the parks and basically the public services that urban residents enjoy. And so they were able to continue to manipulate the urban vote and the immigrant vote as a result of the services they were providing urban dwellers. All right, so then you're looking at kind of the response here to the new immigrants. So the social gospel is Christians in the city saying, if you're a Christian, you're supposed to help folks who are struggling. And the YMCA and the Salvation Army comes out of that. Also our guy William Jennings Bryan, also Martin Luther King. And if you move back, our believers in the social gospel. They didn't call it the social gospel, but those Second Great Awakening abolitionist Christians also very much part of that. Jane Addams is somebody who believes in it. She's the first social worker. She's got the whole house in Chicago. Let's see if we can pull it up here. If I go down, nothing happens. Let's try it again. There's the leisure activities. There's the boxing. There's the new immigrants. So there she is. And she's got those sad, weary, good eyes, right? I love her eyes. She's been doing good and godly work her whole life, and she's tired, but, it's the right kind of tired, the kind of tired you want after you give everything your best for as long as you possibly can. Let's see. So social work kind of comes out of James Adams' efforts. All right, the folks who are not rolling out the welcome mat are the nativists. There's no nothing party this time, but it's the American Protective Association. And here's the things they're worried about. They're worried about scabs. They're worried about kind of the Orthodox Christianity and the Judaism, the radical politics of the socialists and the anarchists, and they were seen as racially different. Slavs and slaves come together. Italians weren't considered to be white. There's the Statue of Liberty poem. France. I found it out when I researched it, teaching it to the college prep class. France gave the Statue of Liberty to the United States in honor of Abraham Lincoln, but it became a symbol of immigration, thanks to that poem at the base of it. All right. So, hey, maybe you want to review for a second. I'm going to go up here and see which way we're going. Okay. We're going to get rid of the famous writers. We just didn't do that one. All right, Darwin is writing at this time, so this is kind of city intellectual stuff. And everybody, in America of late 1800s got to decide what they think of Darwin. Some religious fundamentalists are going to say, we've got no room in our faith for him, and we've got, and then some are going to be accommodationists. We're going to see that soon. All right. Anything else? The WCTU is going to be against drinking. Carrie Nation is going to chop up bars when she is with hatchets. She's a big, tall lady. I believe I'm going to do a slide on her in class. You know, we can't skip her. All right. Don't worry about the yellow journalism. That's a rerun because you're going to get the yellow journalists in the chapter on the Spanish-American War. So now we're to the West. Okay. So you got the Plains Indians tribes. And the Plains Indians tribes. And so we'll go, let's see if we can, I think all classes did at least some of this chapter in class. So the Plains Indian tribes, who you got? You got the Sioux up north in the Dakotas. You got the Apache in the Southwest. You got the Comanche in Texas. You got the Cheyenne in Wyoming. They're mobile because they got the horses from the Columbian Exchange. Their way of life based on the buffalo. Not only do they eat it, their weapons, their dwellings, everything's made out of one part of the buffalo or another. So when, the government starts fighting them, they go after the buffalo. The treaties would forever be broken. The treaties would be signed with somebody who we would call chief. The provisions that were guaranteed would be not provided. The agents would steal the provisions. And then 10 years later, the government would go back on the treaty and say we need the land again. All right, you've got massacres at Sand Creek. That's an Indian massacre. Then there's a guy named Fetterman that gets killed along with all the soldiers with him. The big-time massacre, I would say, in fact, is going to be Custer at the Little Bighorn. So gold is found in South Dakota. Custer's this Democratic Civil War hero's got designs on a political career, and he doesn't wait for backup. So he goes down at the Little Bighorn, next to the Little Bighorn River, and he thinks he's got the Indians caught by surprise. Instead, Sitting Bull, the Medicine Man, and Crazy Horse surround him and kill everybody. The year is 1876. So it's called Custer's Last Stand. It's really the Indians' last stand. After that, you're going to get the full force of the American Army raining down their fury on the Plains Indians because you got this big massacre in the centennial year. So Chief Joseph gets chased all over Montana, Wyoming, almost makes it to the border, gets captured. He's famous for saying, "I will fight no more forever," because the women and the children were suffering so much. Geronimo's like the last holdout, and he kills a lot of people he doesn't like. He's not peaceful, but he gets chased into Mexico, gets chased out of Mexico, and finally gets captured, and he ends up dying on a reservation in Florida. Wounded Knee is where the ghost dance is taking place on this reservation. And remember, the ghost dance is this belief that by ghost dancers that their dance is going to bring back the buffalo and the ancestors and going to make the whites disappear. And it makes like the guards nervous, and they're going to take up all the guns, but somebody shoots a gun, and so the guards kill everybody. There at Wounded Knee. But that's the last bit of Indian resistance. All right, so coming out of that, you got a book called The Century of Dishonor, talking about the mistreatment of the natives. And then the Dawes Act is going to give away 160 acres of free land like the Homestead Act. It said the land, and it's after the Homestead Act chronologically. We cover it first. But the tools are going to be no good. The Indians are really going to struggle to live as farmers in nuclear families. Let's go with Indian schools here. The Carlisle Indian School, and so the saying is you save the man by killing the Indian, and you try to force Indians to assimilate, and it doesn't work out well. All right, for cowboys, you got the cattle drive, and so these are Texans with the Longhorns. There's three groups of folks that make up the cowboys. Is Civil War veterans, most of them Confederates. And then, I don't know, let's say two groups. Groups of minorities. So you got African Americans, you got Mexicans, and you got Indians. About 2/3 of them of the cowboys are white Texans. And then 1/3 are these other minority groups. But a substantial minority of cowboys are minority groups. All right, they're taking the Longhorns to Texas, where you will find cattle towns and trains. But the cattle drives are going to end for 3 reasons. We better get that one in there. Why did they end? And it's going to be barbed wire fences. It's going to be overgrazing. The cattle are competing with buffalo and even sheep, and they're eating too much grass. And then the weather goes bad. You got a couple of really bad winters, followed by 10 years of drought. So the cowboy period only lasts from 20 years, from 1865, 1885, 20 years after the Civil War. All right, then you got the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act is for the farmers, where, the farmers are given 160 acres free land, and they go out there. And they've got to turn up the sod. It's dry out there, and they've got to do dry farming techniques, and they've got to agree to live there for 5 years and farm and wherever the land is for 5 years. And we get the word dugout from it, because they'd have these funky houses where the floor is below where the ground is. All right. So that's the Homestead Act. Let's see what else we want to say about the Homestead Act. So that brings, the combination of the Homestead Act, Transcontinental Railroad, brings all these settlers along with the army out here, kind of spells the end for the Indians. The writings on the wall. Homestead Act was in 1862, so it takes a generation to defeat the Indians, but that's why Indians get defeated, because you got folks living out there now. And so the frontier closes. And so Turner argues in his Frontier thesis, now that somebody, the census of 1890 shows that there's no place in America where nobody lives anymore. And the frontier, the significance of the frontier is about American identity, of rugged individualism, and we can take care of ourselves, and the American dream, and we can always start over out west somewhere. And so the Turner thesis is that the closing of the frontier really changes American identity. And it's very insightful in terms of telling us how we think about ourselves. It's wrong, factually wrong, in the sense that people didn't move out west because of rugged individualism. The government helped them. The Homestead Act gave away land. The Army fought against the Indians and protected the settlers. And government irrigation techniques allowed people to live out there. And when people move, they move to the cities. So that's a pretty good thing. So let's put it this way. 4 reasons the thesis is wrong. So it's a good thesis. It's an insightful thesis, but it's factually, empirically wrong. All right. So then you're coming to the farmers. All right. So let's see if we can work our way down. Wow. Hopefully we have. So there's all the cowboys and Indian stuff. Yeah, there's the cowboys. All right, so here you got the farmers' problems. Now, if we were moving at a more leisurely pace, I'd come up with a way of learning these things. Some of them are economic. Some of them have, like, the one crop, the world market, the deflation. Like the market itself, economic realities going right here. And then here you got the way the farmers are kind of being screwed, either with interest rates getting charged, the property taxes, or the shipping rates. And then you have natural problems. So try to get, 5 or so, at least 4 or 5 of these learned. But they're having a hard time. And we see they are no longer the majority by 1876, Panic of 1873. So by the time Bryan comes along, they're hitting really the 40% mark, down below the 40% mark. All right, so you got this Mary Lease. So you got 3 farmers groups, the Grange and the Alliance and the Populist. You got Mary Lease, famous for saying we need to raise less corn and more hay. Get involved in politics and also understand the economics of overproduction. All right, there's those Populist proposals again. And so then you're going to have the election. So McKinley is your standard Benjamin Harrison, Grover Cleveland kind of pro industrialist politician. He's for the gold standard. Gold results in deflation. It's good for creditors and banks. So he makes farmers mad, Southerners, Westerners, and so the Democrats nominate Bryan, who makes this famous speech, "Shall not crucify mankind on a cross of gold." And the Populist, so remember now, it was an anti-Bryan drawing here, but the Populist political party gets behind Bryan, and their one and only issue is going to be silver. And he works real hard. McKinley doesn't work real hard, but McKinley's got the industrialists on his side, so he wins. Bryan only gets the southern and western farmers. He doesn't get the urban workers. He doesn't get northern Catholic farmers who are don't really like, would kind of be persuaded by this cartoon that shouldn't go all tent revival in your political campaigns. All right, things got better for the farmers, and so, he's going to run again in 1900, but on an anti-imperialism thing right there. All right, so hey, I'm going to stop it right there. Pause it for a second. Take a breath, drink a cup of coffee. Okay, and then we go back to the review sheet. All right, and the review sheet gets more recent. So you've got the yellow journalism here. All right, so it's the reasons for imperialism. And if we go to the progressive one, yep, and we go all the way. So there's your reason for empire. So the economic reason, the yellow press is for it. You want the markets. The yellow journalists want it. And you've got kind of the military reason. Mahan says you need a strong navy if you're going to be a strong country. And then kind of the ideas. Josiah Strong says kind of the next step in manifest destiny is to expand. And Roosevelt, and I've been reading a lot about these two. Lodge is kind of the senator, the politician that is pushing the career of Teddy Roosevelt. Lodge is not a very effective politician, so he knows he can't be president. But he kind of wants to be the behind-the-scenes guy who creates, and he's the behind-the-scenes guy who kind of creates the political career of Teddy Roosevelt. But both of them believe in social Darwinism, the survival of the fittest country. All right. So let's see what the review sheet says then. All right, so we're trying to move kind of quick, and also you have you got like a video that shows you the slides. All right, so Hawaii, two things going to go on in Hawaii. The sugar planters want to make it part of the United States. It's in their economic interest. There won't be tariff issues. They'll get good prices for their sugar. More Americans will buy Hawaiian sugar. Then during the war, Hawaii is taken over as a coaling station for ships on their way to the Philippines or to China. So military stuff to the Philippines, economic stuff to China. The Cuban Rebellion. So the Cubans won their independence. Word gets back to the United States that the Cubans are being mistreated. You got the story of concentration camps, General Weyler the Butcher. So the ship, the Maine, gets sent to Cuba, and it blows up. It's a coal explosion. Wasn't the Spanish that did it, but Roosevelt and the Yellow Journal. So Roosevelt and Hearst, the editor of the New York Journal, really worked together to blame it on the Spanish. Some in Congress passed the Teller Amendment saying, hey, we promise we're fighting this war for good and humanitarian reasons to rescue the Cubans, not to be an imperialist. But then at the end of the war, the Platt Amendment says, well, we can take the place over if we want to. We can send in the troops if we want to. They're not allowed to. We can tell them what to do, tell the Cubans what to do, not to run a big debt, not to make treaties without our say-so. So we're kind of acquiring Cuba. Dewey is the biggest war hero. He really whoops up on the Spanish Navy in the Philippines, and he works with Aguinaldo, who's the rebel leader on the ground in the Philippines to defeat the Spanish. And it goes real well in the Philippines. Teddy Roosevelt's the leader of the Rough Riders. He had been the Assistant Secretary of Navy. He had made himself into this tough guy. He was a big-time imperialist. I've just been reading that Leading up to the war, around the time of the war, he goes to college to make a speech and says the word 67 times. Just loves war. Says war's good for your character, makes a man out of you. And the Rough Riders are kind of the heroes of the war by default. Roosevelt's the default hero of the war. Dewey says he doesn't want to become president, and Roosevelt does. And so gets elected in 1898 as governor of New York, and then becomes, in 1900, becomes McKinley's vice president. All right, so splendid little war because not many people die. Way more people die of disease and of the conditions of getting shot. The results of the war, we have an empire. Treaty of Paris gives us the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam. And we had already gotten Hawaii during the war, and we're practically in charge of Cuba. So practically getting 5 places, really. Those dang stubborn Filipinos wanted their independence, though. They weren't fighting to become part of the United States. They were fighting for independence, led by Aguinaldo. So we go over there, and McKinley decides to keep it. We're going to run it, and we put people in camps, just like the Spanish had done to the Cubans, and we do that water cure, water torture kind of thing. And so Taft comes over and smooths things over and treats folks better and improves living conditions with roads and education and fighting against diseases. And so the Filipinos like Taft better than, the Americans initially. All right, at the end of that chapter, you've got the open door policy by John Hay, and keeping the door for trade to China open. All right, and then finally, you've got, where to go? So you got Roosevelt's stuff. All right, let me try to double up on Roosevelt because in no class have we covered Roosevelt. So we got to the end of it, but then we didn't go President Roosevelt. All right, so there it is again. Roosevelt becomes vice president. All right, and the issue is imperialism. So this time Bryan's running against imperialism, not the industrialists. McKinley gets killed by an anarchist, Czolgosz, and so now Roosevelt's the president. All right, Roosevelt gets permission to dig a canal. He wants a canal. Congress doesn't want it, but he just starts a revolution and starts digging the canal. Takes 6 years. A lot of disease gets eradicated, but it's kind of a force of will, and you just got that picture of Roosevelt. Loves kind of a little kid who loves war and he loves playing war. He's a little kid who loves playing war. Is a nice way of putting it. All right. The Roosevelt corollary of the Monroe Doctrine is that we're now in charge. We're an imperialist country, and we're in charge of Latin America. If Latin America owes any money to anybody, we'll collect the debt. So it's an addition to the Monroe Doctrine says, don't come around here no more. You can't come around here, Europe, even if they owe you money. We'll collect the debts. And so we kind of become the sheriff of the Western Hemisphere. Anytime there's instability in any Latin American country, especially a Caribbean country, we send in the Navy. All right. Ironically, he wins the Nobel Prize and for making peace between Russia and Japan, and he makes what's called the Gentleman's Agreement with Japan, saying that Japanese kids can go to California schools, but Japanese immigration's got to stop. And he sends the Great White Fleet, the white, painted American Navy around the world to show how big and tough we are. All right. So look at there. Okay. All right. So then let me go to the review sheet. And the last thing y'all are going to do is the progressive chapter. All right. So let's see what we're going to say about the progressives here. See if I can get through the thing. I'm going to try to get through it in 6 minutes. 9:15 is my goal. All right. So the progressives. The progressives are reformers. They're middle-class reformers that are reformers word. So we're coming back home, and they're fighting against all the problems of the cities. The industrialists, the party bosses, the child labor, the living conditions. So you got a number of, and a lot of them are riders. These riders are called muckrakers. So you got Veblen. That'll make sense to you once you've been in class. Writing about how, these rich folks just got it made and they never have to work. Reese writes the opposite book about, the really poor folks in the cities. It's a book of pictures of folks living in the tenements in the cities. All right, the progressives tend to be middle-class folks, a few socialists, but not many, Christians who believe in social gospels, and a lot of ladies. This is a middle-class, women-driven movement in certain ways. All right, now Roosevelt's going to become president, and so he's very, very centrist, so he feels like the muckrakers are too radical. So he says, y'all are always writing about bad stuff. When people gripe about, the fake news today, they say they're always coming up with all kinds of awful problems. There were magazines, McClure's and Cosmopolitan. We'll talk about Cosmopolitan in class. A couple more muckrakers, Lincoln Steffens, I think it's Steffans, writes Shame of the Cities about the party bosses. And Ida Tarbell writes about, the corrupt economic practices of Rockefeller and Standard Oil. All right. They're going to push political reform. So the initiative and the referendum, remember, they're like the populists. So we got to do a compare and contrast. The populists and the progressives. They don't like the bosses, so they want direct primaries where voters in a political party choose the candidates rather than the party bosses. They're going to limit how much money industrialists can give to a political campaign. Come up with a secret ballot, really the Australian ballot. Direct election of senators rather than the boss-chosen state government. So again, that was a populist thing. And then city managers rather than mayors chosen by party bosses. So all about professional, uncorrupt politics. Fighting Bob LaFollette is going to be a Wisconsin politician, really fights for this. I'd say he's the main one to worry about. All right, I'm going to pause just for a second. Take a breath. Okay, and there they are. All right. So the women are the leaders of this thing, and they're exposed to the problems by working as social workers in these settlement houses with Jane Addams, and then they're going to say, look, if we're going to solve these problems, we need the right to vote. So they're going to be pushing real hard for the right to vote. Their issue is kind of a cult of domesticity. Let's make America a little kinder, gentler, more compassionate. Things that, they've got a sense of motherhood almost to these kids and these folks living in these brutal conditions. So, the cult of the compassionate side, how women make men a little more gentle. All right. There's interesting stuff going on. Mueller versus Oregon. And these two court cases are going to be whether or not women are physically able to do the same kind of jobs as men. So that's interesting. And the first time the court rules for women in Oregon, it rules against them in New York. But the issue is it's kind of the first time you get a limit on working hours, but it's for women, not for men. So, just a real interesting thing that we'll talk about in class. Got to go quick. All right, the event that really kind of spurs the rise of progressives is the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, where you got women getting killed in this factory, and the door's locked, and so it catches on fire, and they can't get out. And it's a high rise. The factory's like at the 7th floor of the top of this building. They get in, so it's like 9/11. They're either burning to death or they're jumping out, and everybody's looking at them, watching it happen. Nobody can do anything about it. So the owners of the Shirtwaist Factory look awful. And so a lot of local governments passed stronger workplace safety laws. All right. The women hate the saloons. They're seen as, the symbol of everything awful. The party boss, corrupt elections, all of it still, drunk husbands. Fought by the WCTU. The 18th Amendment is coming, but when it comes, half the country had already passed state laws against drinking. So wets were people who lived in the cities who thought drinking ought to be legal. Dries were rural folks who were against it. All right. I'm just going to take a breath. All right, here I go again. So here comes Roosevelt. He gets elected president. He's got this thing called the Square Deal. So in the Square Deal, Here he's kind of the ultimate moderate. So he's going to be halfway in between kind of Bryan and the common man and Carnegie and the businessman, right? So he wants to be on everybody's side, which is one reason people look back on Roosevelt domestically, and everybody likes him. He's this guy that loves the job, and he's not really, the ultimate moderate when it comes to domestic issues. There's 3 C's of the square deal: corporation, consumers, and conservation. Corporation, big business. Consumers, going to make products safe, and then conservation, national parks. There's going to be a strike between the coal miners and the mine owners, and he's going to be the first guy. He doesn't take the side of the miners, but he says they've got the right to go on. He negotiates a compromise, so he's standing up to the leaders. Also, the square deal. There's going to be an Elkins Act pass and the Hepburn Act. So these are both laws where you're standing up to the railroads. He's going to call himself a trust buster. So he's breaking up big businesses. He's breaking up one of Morgan's railroads. But he doesn't go after all trusts. So he doesn't go after Standard Oil. So he says if a trust is benefiting society, oil's like good for society, he's not going after them. But he goes after the railroads here. So again, very moderate, even though he sees himself as a big tough guy. All right, consumers, he reads Upton Sinclair's The Jungle about meatpacking industry. And the FDA gets passed Pure Food and Drug Act. Sets aside lots of land for conservation, kind of the father of our national forest system. Got a couple of conservationists working with him there. There he is at Yosemite there. All right, that's that one. Let's go one more. All right, gracious, taking too long. All right, so Roosevelt decides not to run again, but he picks his best buddy to carry on his policies. So Taft runs as a Republican. He brings Bryan and our old buddy Eugene Debs, the socialist. And so Taft is president, mild-mannered guy, and talks softer than Roosevelt does on everything and does more. So he's going to do dollar diplomacy to invest in Latin America, but he ends up intervening in more Latin American countries than Roosevelt does when they're not enacting pro-American policies. He sues the trust more times than Roosevelt does, breaks up Standard Oil, sues U.S. Steel, so sues the big boys to an extent that Roosevelt won't. Sets aside more land for conservationists, but he fires this buddy of Roosevelt's, an environmentalist named Pinchot, who goes running to Roosevelt and tells on him. And so Roosevelt comes back home from Africa, starts a kind of hardcore, progressive, kind of left kind of party, and runs against Taft. With this new nationalism that the national government ought to take on big business a lot. And that's it. All right. What do? I never can remember. I believe I do this, don't I?